In this video, we're going to go over how to do two very similar problems or related problems. So we're going to first compute the greatest common divisor of two numbers, and then the next thing we'll do is we'll compute the least common multiple of those two numbers. And to do the first problem, we're going to use what's called the Euclidean algorithm. Another video that I've posted, we used what's called a factor tree to find the greatest common divisor. Sometimes it's hard to know what the factors of a number are, though. So for example, 4,199, it's hard to know just by looking at it what the factors of that are. And so it might be hard for you to start your factor tree. And so that's a reason that we might need a different strategy. And in this case, that strategy is going to be the Euclidean algorithm. All right, so let's get started with this. So how do we start this? So remember, the Euclidean algorithm is really just repeated division with remainder. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take our two numbers, we're going to divide the larger number by the smaller one, and we'll keep track of both the quotient and the remainder. All right, so to start, so we have 4,199. We're going to divide that by the smaller number, which is 156. To do this, we can use our calculator. So I'm going to go ahead and put that into my calculator. You can do the same as you're watching the video. And what do we get? So we get 26, so that's our quotient. And then we get a long decimal after that. It's actually what's called a repeating decimal. That decimal doesn't give us the whole number, it doesn't give us the remainder as a whole number, which is what we really want. And so in order to find the remainder as a whole number, we're going to have to do a little extra work. And so what we need to do is we need to take this 156, multiply it by 26, and then see how far away from 4,199 we are. Because what are we really doing? So we are figuring out how many groupings of 156 are there in this larger number. We know there are 26. And then we want to know how many are left over after that. All right, so if we take 156 and multiply it by 26, so what do we get? So we check in our calculators. So when I do that, I get 4,056. So 26 groupings of 156 is this many. So it's 4,056. And so now I need to know, well, how many are left over after I do all of those groupings? And so to do that, to figure that out, I will do subtraction. So I take 4,199 and I subtract 4,056, the number that I get from my groupings. All right, and so when I do that, I get 143. And so that is my remainder after I put together all of my groupings. Okay, so let's just highlight that. So this number here, this 143 that I get from my remainder, is from this computation over here. So it's actually two computations, right? I have to figure out, well, how many are there in 26 groupings of 156? And then how many are left over. So those are my two computations that I need to do for this process. Okay, so that is our remainder. It is 143. And now here's the part where I'm going to repeat my division with remainder. So now I have new sets of numbers to work with. So I'm going to take this 156. I'm going to divide it by this new remainder that I got. And now I repeat that process. So I figure out what is my quotient and what is my remainder when I do this. So my quotient here, so I can either just think about this for a second or use a calculator. So 143, it's actually pretty close to 156. And so if I had more than one grouping of this, I would definitely be over 156. And so that tells me that my quotient should be 1. It doesn't tell me what my remainder is. So in order to do that, I need to repeat this process that I had up here to figure out how many are left over. So far what I have is I know that there is one grouping of 143. So I have 143 times 1, which is just 143. And then how many are left over? So that means I want to take 156 minus 143. So how far away is this grouping from what I wanted to get to, which is 156? And I can do this computation off to the side. I can use my calculator. Maybe I can do some mental math. And so this should be 13. All right, and so this 13, this is our remainder. So let's just highlight that. So this 13 is going to go right here. And now we're done with that line. All right, now's a good time to check in and remind ourselves, how long do we do this for? So we keep repeating division with remainder until we get a remainder that is 0. We're not there yet, and so that means we have to do this process again. So I bring down my 143. I divide that by the remainder that I got. So I'm using my previous line. So in both of these steps, I'm using numbers from the previous line to figure out what my new computation is. All right, so now I'm going to divide 143 divided by 13. Ooh, and we actually get a whole number. So what does that tell us? So when we divide that, we get 11. And since we got a whole number, that means there is no remainder. So our remainder in this case is 0. All right, so now let's just think for a second, or maybe you can rewind in the video and remind yourself, what do we do now? So remember, we said before that we repeat this process until we get a remainder of 0. We are now at that step. And so that means that the previous remainder that we found was going to be the GCD of the two numbers we started with. All right, so it's kind of a lot to keep track of, but now let's just highlight that number. So it's this 13. And remember, this 13 actually shows up in two places because I have the 13 up here, but then that was also telling me what did I divide by. So this was the last number I divided by for this computation. So you can pull that 13 from either spot. And so this tells us that the GCD of our two numbers, so 4,199 and 156, that is equal to 13. And again, that 13 is the number from these previous steps. So it's either the last non-zero remainder or it's this last number that we divided by. Those are the same values always. Okay, and remember at this point we could check just to make sure our computations are right. So we could take this number 13, divide it into both of these numbers, and make sure that we get a whole number. So that's one way to check that at least our answer makes some sense, right? Because if we don't get a whole number, then that means that this 13 is not a divisor of at least one of the numbers. And so you can always check to make sure that you have a divisor. Okay, so let's move on to the second part. So now we want to compute the least common multiple of these two numbers. And remember, so in both of these problems, we're looking at common. So that means what they have in common, what's the overlap between the numbers that we have. And so here we're looking at multiples of these two numbers. We want to know which multiples do they have in common, and then what's the smallest one that we get. So we're looking for the smallest positive multiple that both of these numbers have. All right, so I'm going to scroll down. And let's separate this off a little bit. So there are a couple of ways to get this. So let me just rewrite what my numbers are. So it was 4,199 and it was 156. So one way to get this would be to just start making a list of all of the multiples of each of these numbers. So in my list, I would have 4,199, then I would multiply it by 2, then I would multiply it by 3, keep making my list. I would have to make another list for 156. But these numbers are kind of large, and so it might take us a while in order to find a common multiple. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to use a formula that gives us that common multiple. So the least common multiple of these two numbers we can find in the following way. So we're going to take the product of the two numbers, and then we will divide by the GCD of those two numbers. So let me just highlight this again in the same color as before. This 13 is the same 13 from the previous step. So in order to find the least common multiple using this formula, we first need to find the greatest common divisor. Okay, so now that we have a formula, we can just go ahead and use our calculators to figure out what this is. So let's see, so we have 4,199 times 156, and we get a rather large number, which makes sense because both of these numbers are somewhat large. So we get 655,044. And then we're going to divide that number by 13. And what do we get? We still get a large number, smaller, of course, because we're dividing by 13, but we get 50,388. So this number here, this is the least common multiple of these two numbers. So that means that this number is divisible by both of these numbers, and it's the smallest positive number that satisfies that. So it's the smallest positive number that is divisible by both of these numbers.